Ich stelle mich kurz vor, ich bin Franz Sinabel, ich arbeite am WIFO im Forschungsbereich Umwelt, Klima, Energie und ich kann Ihnen heute einen Gast präsentieren, der perfekt in unser Profil hineinpasst. Und ich sage auch kurz den Kontext, warum wir den Herrn Fadinger eingeladen haben. Wir haben nämlich ein Projekt mit einem Auftraggeber in Deutschland, der uns motiviert, darüber nachzudenken, das bestehende Instrument des CBAM, also des Carbon-Ausgleichsmechanismus auf internationaler Ebene, zu erweitern, um Sektoren, die bisher im Effort-Sharing-Bereich drinnen sind, ganz konkret Agrargüter zu erweitern. Und da ist die Sache natürlich die, dass CBAM an sich schon eine sehr harte Nuss zu knacken ist. Und wenn man dann sich auf Güter noch verständigt, die in ihrer Produktionsweise sehr unterschiedlich auf der ganzen Welt erzeugt werden, ist das schwierig, das zu verstehen, und daher sind wir auf der Suche nach einfacheren Zugängen, und ich glaube, der Herr Fadinger kann uns da etwas Licht ins Dunkel bringen. Herrn Fadinger, darf ich Sie bitten, nun das Seminar zu übernehmen. Vorweg, die Präsentation wird etwa 40 Minuten dauern. Herr Fadinger stellt eine komplexe Sache, die das System vereinfacht, ein bisschen umfassender dar. Das heißt, Fragen, die sich ergeben, werden möglicherweise im Verlauf der Präsentation beantwortet. Ich bitte daher nur Verständnis, Fragen, die ad hoc große Probleme aufwerfen, zu stellen, damit der Herr Fadinger in der vorgegebenen Zeit auch fertig sein kann. Es wird diesmal abweichend vom Format keine Diskussion geben, sondern ich werde nach der Präsentation die Fragerunde eröffnen, und wir sind hoffentlich, wir werden in einer Stunde fertig sein. Vielen Dank.
Okay, many thanks for the invitation to WIFO. I'm Harald Fadinger. I'm professor of economics at the University of Vienna. I'm also a research fellow in international trade and climate change in the environment at the Center of Economic Policy Research. The paper I'm going to present today is called Designing Effective Border Adjustment with Minimal Information Requirements. And this is joint work with Alessia Campolmi, Chiara Follati, Sabine Stilger, and Ulrich Wagner. So as you're well aware, in 2015, 196 countries signed the Paris Accord. And the aim of this agreement was to cut emissions by 50% until 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. Yet, in 2024, only 25% of global greenhouse gas emission were subject to some type of carbon taxes or carbon trade policies. So that worldwide countries tackle this target at different speeds, and the EU is probably the entity that is taking this goal most seriously and has introduced a very significant carbon price. But given the lack of global coordination in carbon pricing, there's significant risk of carbon leakage. So that if the domestic carbon price increases in the EU, this is going to lead to significant cost disadvantage of European producers relative to foreign competitors, which is going to lead to what we call carbon leakage. So clean domestic production is replaced by dirty foreign production, and thereby counteracting the EU's emission reduction efforts. As a consequence of this, in 2021, the EU has started a legislative process to increase ambitions related to carbon pricing and to prevent carbon leakage via the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this meant a change in the paradigm that trade policy cannot be used to enforce climate policy. So if we look at the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, it basically has three objectives, namely to deter carbon leakage to third countries, but second, also to provide incentives for emission reductions abroad, and probably also a third one, namely to encourage foreign countries to adopt carbon pricing. And this is kind of an extraterritorial effect of EU policies. So how does the CBAM mechanism that has been proposed work? Well, you have to calculate the CO2 emissions embedded in the imports from non-EU countries. And this means one has to calculate the actual emissions of production at the plant level in the origin country. So this is, at the moment, this is limited to scope 1 emissions, so those that are process related. But currently not included are scope 2 emissions, so the ones embodied in energy, or scope 3, the emissions that are embodied in the inputs, the foreign inputs to the foreign production process. Now, the CBAM certificates have to be bought for each ton of embedded emissions by European importers, and the price of these certificates is linked to the European emission trading system price. So in that respect, CBAM levels the playing field in the European market for domestic firms and foreign importers into the EU. However, EU exports to third markets, right, they are not basically brought to a level playing field because they still face a cost disadvantage relative to foreign producers. What is, I think, is the main problem of the current implementation of CBAM is that the information requirements are formidable, right? Because you really have to compute at the level of each global production plant the emissions that are embodied in the local production. And because this is so difficult, CBAM initially applies only to a limited amount of very energy-intensive sectors, aluminum and steel, cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity. Now, this limited applicability, of course, has effects as well, because it's going to distort the production process within sectors. So, for example, given the current scope of CBAM, it makes sense to offshore the production of a final good that embodies carbon-intensive intermediates to foreign countries. Let's say it makes sense to offshore a car from Europe to China or to outside the EU, because you can import the car from outside the EU without having to pay a carbon tax on the contained imports. Right? So this is clearly distortive. But I think the key problem is that there's a lot of moral hazard involved that makes it difficult to extend this idea to more sectors. And in particular, if you want to also target scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, right? Because if you think of an iPhone, it has around 1,600 parts. If you need to compute how much carbon is contained in each of these 1,600 inputs to compute the carbon content of the iPhone correctly, you're getting basically into a bureaucratic nightmare. Second, basically, CBAM is going to put a lot of the costs of carbon mitigation on the foreign countries. And it will also discriminate across goods and origin countries, which is not compatible with the World Trade Organization's mandate of the most favored nation principle, where you cannot discriminate basically among source countries in a given sector. So likely this is going to lead to troubles with the WTO, but it is certainly also going to lead to opposition in the exporting countries that have to bear part of the cost of CBAM, right? So in our opinion, the very high ambitions of CBAM to do everything perfectly threaten the feasibility, both because of political opposition, but also because, as we show, to really effectively mitigate leakage, you need to basically extend this to all sectors, and that's going to be very difficult given the current complexity of the mechanism. We therefore, in this paper, consider an alternative border adjustment mechanism that to some extent is less ambitious because it focuses on preventing leakage, but doesn't provide incentives for other countries to reduce emissions per se, or to adopt carbon pricing per se. And we call this mechanism the leakage border adjustment mechanism. And we're going to use a quantitative trade model to compare different border adjustment mechanisms in terms of their welfare effects. But also in terms of the effect on carbon leakage and trade. Okay, so let me first give you the gist of our proposal. So the main idea here is very simple. Remember what is driving carbon leakage? If the EU carbon price, so the ETS price increases, this effectively increases production costs in Europe, right? And that increases the prices of EU producers relative to foreign competitors. And this basically leads to substitution, basically, between domestically produced products and imported products. And if the foreign products are more carbon intensive than the domestic one, this basically means that carbon leaks abroad. And LBAM is exactly designed to offset that cost disadvantage related to the European carbon price increase. So basically, it's going to impose a tariff and potentially an export tax that brings basically the level of import back to where they were before the carbon price increase, right? And the level of exports potentially as well. So in a very simple demand and supply diagram, consider a market where the EU is an importer, so this is on the left. Given world prices P0, the EU imports more or demands more than it produces, and the difference between imports and exports is import demand. So MD basically is a downward sloping curve. If domestic prices were higher, where the supply crosses the demand, then import demand would be zero, right? And similarly, we think of the rest of the world as having an upward sloping export supply curve, meaning that the EU is sufficiently large so that its demand has an effect on world prices, right? But think of this basically as being the foreign marginal cost curve, the perfect competition. So if the EU introduces a carbon tax, tau E, this effectively shifts the EU supply curve to the left, right? Because the marginal production costs for each unit increase. And this per se is going to lead to an increase in import demand for from foreign. Because with the new supply curve, the difference between demand and supply for any given price is larger now. So the import demand curve shifts to the right? So what happens with an increase in the EU carbon price, so tau E increases, is that import demand goes from the blue bar to the green bar. And the difference between the green and the blue is basically carbon leakage if we think of the rest of the world as being more carbon intensive in production, right? So this is clearly not efficient. But what do we need to do if we want to avoid the increase in imports related to the shift in the European supply curve? Well, we can always impose a tariff on imports that brings imports back to the blue level where they initially were. So if the EU imposes this vertical tariff, LBAM, here. This would effectively increase the cost to domestic consumers for foreign supplied goods, right? And if you design this import tariff in the right way, you can bring back import demand where it initially was, right? This means, of course, that there's no change in imports when the domestic carbon price increases. And this means there's no leakage, right? What do we need to know actually to design this tariff? Well, we basically only need to know by how much the domestic supply curve shifts when there's a domestic carbon price increase. So it's kind of through on EU producers on their costs. And we need to know basically the slopes of the demand and the supply curve, right? So the elasticities of supply and demand intuitively. And that's all we need. Okay. So this is basically the gist of what we're proposing. You can do something very similar on the export side, right? So also on the export side, EU supply to the rest of the world is reduced. This basically is replaced basically by imports from some other countries in the rest of the world. And this also causes export-related leakage if the rest of the world produces the stuff in a dirtier fashion than the EU. And you actually would need export subsidies to undo this effect. Okay. Okay. So to see as a proof of concept how this idea does quantitatively when we compare it to other carbon adjustment mechanisms, we are going to put this into a theoretical model of international trade. The model is intentionally written in a way that it's basically partial equilibrium, so that you can basically estimate the supply and demand parameters as well as the cost function at a very, very detailed level. So we use 4-digit data, and we will have around 140 manufacturing sectors. This is much more granular than the standard CGE models that are usually used, right? And this actually is important because the more you lump different stuff together, the more similar the aggregate sectors will look, right? And you can actually have much more leakage than you would think otherwise, right? So we'll show how all these objects can be estimated using readily available data. There is no need to measure the actual carbon content of foreign imports with this mechanism. And that is why it is much easier to introduce this mechanism in all the sectors than the current CBAM proposal of the EU. Right? Do you have any questions so far? Okay. What is our main results? To give you a preview, well, any effective border adjustment mechanism should be applied to all sectors and should not be limited to a few energy-intensive sectors, because a lot basically of the leakage happens via the energy that is embodied in goods. So it's not basically scope 1 emissions, but it's scope 2. We also showed that if you simply use EU carbon intensities instead of actually trying to compute foreign carbon intensities to apply CBAM, then this performs almost as well as the exact CBAM in terms of emission and welfare. So basically, if you use basically the carbon intensity of European steel production, that's actually a relatively good proxy for how much otherwise is contained in steel production that is imported. This would already have substantially lower admin costs. The disadvantage is that this still puts a lot of the burden on the foreign countries, which will see reduced exports to the EU. So, excuse me, why reduced exports? Because now you are going to tax basically the foreign exports based on the carbon content of the EU.
This makes the domestic production as well.
Yes, this is true, but still these goods are going to become more expensive, right? So you can substitute them with something else. You consume less steel and maybe more eggs. I don't know. So that they will reduce basically exports of other countries to the EU as well. Yes?
Did I get it correctly? You do not measure the carbon intensity of the foreign products. You just take the European intensity as a proxy for the worldwide carbon intensity.
Yep, exactly. So this is not LBAM, this is just CBAM with the EU emission intensity. And that already goes a long way, but it's going to put still a burden on the other countries. So this may lead to political opposition from the rest of the world, right? CBAM has the additional advantage, basically, so it's also based on the EU carbon content. But it doesn't basically have any trade impacts on the other countries, right? And therefore, in principle, they should be indifferent because they will be held basically at the status quo ante in terms of welfare. So they will not, in principle, they shouldn't be opposed to that, okay? And we showed that an LBAM that addresses import and export leakage also gets very close to CBAM applied to all sectors in terms of global emission reductions. So whereas the CBAM applied to the few sectors where we have it currently is basically as good as doing nothing. So you can as well forget about carbon border adjustment if you only tax like 5% of the EU imports. Okay. So let me go a bit into the model. We're going to have a multi-country armament model with trade in differentiated products in many sectors. Utility for convenience is quasi linear. The sectors are Cobb-Douglas, and within each sector, varieties are differentiated according to a CES. And there's monopolistic competition, so each variety is produced only by one firm worldwide. The number of firms we take is given for the moment. For simplicity, we will assume that firms have a separate production process for each market. So they can basically produce in a different way, depending on where they export, which might not be completely unrealistic, right? That you can have a clean production process for exports to the EU and a dirtier one for the exports to the rest of the world. We will allow for returns to scale that we will estimate. And firms use a physical input and energy. So these are basically scope 2 emissions, not scope 1 emissions. We don't have process-related emissions. The price of energy is exogenous, and carbon emissions are a byproduct of using energy and are a global bet. And how dirty the energy input is, this we measure from the data, and that can be country-specific. So energy in China is much dirtier than energy in Austria. Okay. So this is basically our utility function, which has this outside good than many sectors, and theta I is basically the global or the country I's marginal social cost of carbon, and ES are basically the emissions in sector S worldwide, right? So it's a global bet to have emissions. And country I puts weight theta I on these global emissions. As I said, within each sectors, varieties are differentiated with a sector's specific elasticity of substitution. From this, you get standard demand function for varieties. So the first index is always the index of the location of consumption. So consumption of good country I of a variety produced in country J in sector S. Okay. The production function, as I said, for simplicity is Cobb-Douglas. ZIJS is basically the energy input to export from location J to I. LIJS is the labor input. VIJS is a bilateral productivity shifter that is unobserved to us, but in principle, there are productivity shocks in this model. Firms are homogeneous for simplicity, so they all have the same VIJS shock. Okay, so it's not the heterogeneous firm model, where firms are different within a sector. From this, you can easily get the marginal cost function, which is a function of output whenever the returns to scale are not constant, right? So increasing in output if you have decreasing returns to scale. And it depends on the energy price. And here we have normalized the wage to 1, which we can do because of this tradable outside sector. Okay, carbon emissions are embodied in the energy input, and DJ is basically how carbon intensive basically energy is in country J. So this is a country-specific parameter that we will measure. The price of energy is equal to the price of energy net of the tax plus the carbon tax per ton of emissions, and DJ is basically what is the amount of carbon that is contained in 1 unit of energy. So when your DJ is larger, basically, then the carbon tax will have more bite on the price of energy, right? Now, the way the model is written, you can solve it sector by sector, and it has closed form solutions for imports, bilateral imports of country I from country J, the prices of imports, and the sectoral price index in terms of tax rates, basically. So basically, we can solve for everything in terms of exogenous parameters, right? Which is convenient because this allows us to also compute counterfactuals very easily. So if you're familiar with quantitative trade models, this is called hat algebra. You basically, this x hat is basically the gross change between a counterfactual equilibrium, x prime, and the initial equilibrium x. And in particular, we're thinking about a counterfactual equilibrium where the EU EU carbon price changes, right? So P set hat, for example, is the gross change in the energy price that is induced by a change in the carbon tax in country J. Of course, the more carbon intensive the production in country J is, the more the energy price will increase in percent. And we can easily compute the response of imports, prices, and the sectoral price index to, in principle, any tax change, right? So we can also compute responses to import tariff, export subsidies, but we're interested in principle to what happens if there is a carbon price change in the EU, an increase in the ETS price. How are imports responding to that? How are exports of the EU responding to that? And it's actually very easy to show that if you have no border adjustment mechanism and you have a domestic carbon price increase, then YII hat, which is basically how much you source from yourself, so EU production that is sourced by the EU consumers, this is going to respond negatively. So smaller than 1 means that in net, the gross change is smaller than 1, so the net change is negative, right? At the same time, there's going to be import leakage. So import response is going to be positive, as I said, and export response of the EU is going to be negative. This is something you can easily show in closed form. And the model also easily allows us to quantify if we put in these numbers. Delta II is basically the initial share of goods that you source from yourself before the change. Okay, so it's your initial absorption share, how much of EU consumption is produced by the EU. Okay, this is a parameter that we need, and The other parameters are estimable. Beta S is basically the energy cost share, gamma S is the returns to scale, and epsilon S is the elasticity of demand. Okay? So if we have information on these parameters and we know basically the EU carbon intensity and the ETS price change, we can compute basically the equilibrium response of all the variables that we're interested in. Let me maybe not, we can also model a CBAM tariff very easily in this model, but let me not go into the details. Let me take more time to report how we can construct LBAM tariffs and LBAM export subsidies. How much time do I still have?
10 minutes.
So I want to know what is the tariff that holds aggregate imports constant in response basically to a EU ETS price increase, right? This tariff can easily be constructed by basically setting YIJS equal to 1. So we're looking basically for the tariff that would hold imports constant in response to a change in carbon prices in the EU. And this is basically the formula that you need to solve. One can show that this tariff is non-discriminatory, so it basically is the same tariff increase relative to every partner country that you need to set, given our CES demand structure at least. And LBAM tariffs are therefore independent of the trade partner and non-discriminatory. In order to hold exports constant, you actually need to set an export subsidy that depends on the pass-through of the energy cost on prices, right? So with constant returns to scale, when gamma is equal to 0, it would be just the Cobb-Douglas cost share, right? The energy price to the power of the Cobb-Douglas cost share of energy. So these export subsidies would also be non-discriminatory. Okay, we need, of course, to calibrate the model to tell you more about global trade and emission and welfare effects. Because the model is basically partial equilibrium and you can solve it sector by sector, you can also use very granular data. So our largest data requirements are the deltas, which are the absorption shares. For this, you need production data and trade data, but trade data available at an even more detailed level. So we go for 131 manufacturing sectors and the EU and 56 other countries. We estimate by sector import demand and export supply or returns to scale elasticities using product level import data and standard methods proposed by the trade literature. We estimate basically production functions at the sector level from German microdata, firm level microdata, when we have expenditure shares at the 4-digit level from Comtrade and UNIDO. And we have the foreign carbon intensity, which we only need to compute basically the equilibrium welfare and emission effects. And to compare with CBAM, we don't need it really for LBAM from different sources. We set the social cost of carbon, so the global social cost of carbon, to $178, so relatively high. What do? We model. Yep.
What's the reason for the 178?
So this is basically the latest consensus estimate, basically. I mean, over time, these consensus estimates have been going up quite a bit, right? Initially, they were at 40, now they're more like at $200 per ton. We simulate basically an empirically realistic ETS price increase from $15 to $105, which is around the ETS price change that we observe in the data between 2018 and 2023. So the EU is basically the country that unilaterally has this ETS price increase. All other countries basically do nothing. And then we compare different scenarios. No BAM, meaning no border adjustment at all. CBAM EU, which is CBAM limited to these very few sectors. CBAM ideal. CBAM ID is basically the ideal CBAM that you would have in all sectors without imperfect information. CBAM easy is basically also CBAM applied to all sectors, but using the EU carbon intensity to compute embedded emission in sectors. And then we have LBAM applied only to imports, or LBAM in addition also imposing export subsidies. Okay, so this is basically what you would get at the average without doing anything. The average imports, so for the average sector, imports would increase by 11%, with a lot of variation, of course, across sectors. CBAM changed this picture much because only in a few sectors, basically, imports would fall where you apply CBAM. CBAM ideal, or CBAM using the European intensities, would reduce average imports, however, by 8%, because on average, foreign countries are dirtier than the EU, so you would shift to EU. And LBAM and LBAM X hold imports exactly constant because they are designed to offset leakage, right? What are the tariffs implied by the different mechanisms? Well, CBAM EU basically has tariffs in only very few sectors, but they can be quite high there. CBAM ideal means that on average, tariffs will go up by 8%, whereas LBAM and LBAM X only have very small tariffs, actually. Small tariffs are sufficient to keep imports constant because these trade elasticities are pretty high, right? So usually trade elasticities are around 4, so if you increase relative prices by 1%, imports will go up down by 4%, right? What happens to EU exports if you don't subsidize exports, which none of the proposals related to CBAM does, then exports to the rest of the world will drop by around 9% on average. LBAM X, export subsidies holds exports constant. On average, you would need a 4% or 3.7% export subsidy to undo basically the negative effect on exports. More interestingly, what happens to global emissions? So without any border adjustment, EU, well, these are mostly manufacturing emissions, will fall by around 30% in response to this increase in carbon prices, which means a global reduction of emissions of 0.85 percentage points. CBAM EU will basically not change that. So it's very similar. It's a 3% additional gain compared to forgetting about border adjustment. The ideal CBAM, or CBAM using the European intensities, would, however, give you almost double global emission reductions, right? So you would reduce global emissions by 1.4 or 1.3 percentage points. On the other hand, LBAM, if you compare the 0.85 with the 0.97, would do significantly better than CBAM EU at the current level. And if you additionally provide export subsidies with LBAM X, you could get to 1.28% of global emissions, so relatively close to the ideal CBAM. Of course, if you were to give the export subsidies on top in the ideal CBAM, you could do even better, right? Okay. So you can also look at how basically you can decompose this further, but maybe skip over that. Let me look at the economic cost, which is just forgetting about the welfare effect of emissions. It's just basically government revenue, consumer surplus, and profits. The economic cost of doing nothing, so of no BAM, just having the EU ETS price increase are relatively large. It's 57 billion euros for the EU per year, I guess. CBAM EU wouldn't change that. The ideal CBAM would have much lower welfare costs to the EU because it would collect a lot of carbon taxes from the rest of the world. But of course, it would have more negative consequences for consumers because they would no longer be able to import the cheap goods that are dirty. LBAM and LBAM-X, in terms of welfare, don't change the picture too much. They still have negative economic costs of 50 billion, basically. So overall, basically, if you consider only the economic effects, then unilateral carbon pricing with the rest of the world doing nothing is basically doesn't make sense from the EU perspective. However, if you attribute basically the global benefit, the global social cost of carbon of $180 to the EU, then this can change. So if we additionally add the environmental benefit, then no BAM or CBAM EU would still give negative welfare effects for the EU, but the ideal CBAM or CBAM Eurozone now would make the welfare effects positive for the EU. And LBAM and LBAM-X basically get you pretty much close to zero, okay? So the question is then finally, how is the rest of the world affected by the different mechanisms? Because we said one advantage of CBAM is that it shifts a lot of the burden to the rest of the world, thereby generating political opposition. So even without any border adjustment, the rest of the world might be negatively affected because basically the clean EU exports are basically replaced by dirty exports from the rest of the world, plus the goods that are pretty cheap without the carbon tax from Europe are no longer competitive. So you can shift to more inefficient sources. The most negative welfare impacts on the rest of the world happen basically under CBAM, which also basically implies that the foreigners can export less to the EU. And with LBAM and LBAM-X, you basically get closer and closer to sterilizing all the negative welfare effects on the rest of the world, right? So with LBAM-X, which sterilizes both EU import and EU export changes, the rest of the world, or each country in the rest of the world, is made indifferent, basically, to the status quo. And therefore, there shouldn't be any political opposition. So to conclude, border adjustment mechanisms can prevent carbon leakage effectively only if they apply to all sectors. If we want to do that, we probably have to think of a mechanism that has lower information requirements than the current one. Then we can think about simple border adjustment mechanisms, those that potentially hurt the rest of the world and those that don't. The standard CBAM basically discriminates across partner countries. It now relies on the environmental exemption of the WTO. But in principle, it doesn't satisfy MFM and therefore will be challenged for sure by affected countries. So and on top of that, it's going to provide a diplomatic backlash, right? So even if the WTO rules that this is going to be fine, they may still retaliate. So our idea is that LBAM is relatively simple to implement if you believe that you can estimate import demand and export supply elasticities, and it doesn't create political opposition abroad because it doesn't have extraterritorial effect. Let me conclude here.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich habe Deutsch zu sprechen begonnen. I move on trying to talk English. Thank you very much for the presentation, which is very inspiring. And well, I see no raised hands right now. Thomas, please go ahead. I'm going to collect a few and then we ask you to answer.
I have two questions. The one is, if you consider a tariff that holds the level of imports constant, as a consequence, I think that domestic production will go down. And this is probably reflected in the consumer benefit, which is lower in all cases, also the ELBAM case. So do you have an idea by how much domestic production goes down in your cases? And the second is, do you think that ELBAM will have different effects on foreign countries? So some countries more affected than others, because this will also not solve the political problem that might come about from the ELBAM concept.
So another hand, please.
I don't quite understand how you actually estimate the tariffs in your mechanism, but is the way that you estimate the required tariffs prone to manipulation? So in some sectors where there's quite a concentrated structure of importers or firms, if you choose a period where the regulatory mechanism is set up, can I manipulate this, or is this safe?
Yeah, I have three questions. No, it's very simple. You estimate the energy intensity as a proxy for the carbon emission using, I think, monetary values, but it is physical intensity that is important. But maybe I didn't understand you correctly. The second element is, in an ideal world, we have one of these BAMs implemented. That's fine. How does the EU come to the next phase? Because the tariffs need to be adjusted at regular intervals, maybe all for 5 years. So you need to have a clever method to estimate a counterfactual. And the third question relates to your future work, maybe, because we know that at the global scale, 30% of carbon emissions come from agriculture, and there it's not energy that is the main cause of emission, but it's other processes. Is your approach suitable to include another input apart from energy?
Okay, let me try to respond. I already forgot one of your two questions, but one was about EU production changes, right? We have it in the presentation somewhere.
Yeah. Okay.
So EU production is going to decline less with ELBAM. Than with other mechanisms. So what happens, of course, is that the European carbon price increases. This increases EU prices relative to the other prices, right? If I put ELBAM, I also make imports a little bit more expensive, right, to bring them back. But it is true, basically, that carbon-intensive products will become more expensive in the EU relative to everything else. And this is going to reduce consumption, right? Because consumers in the EU still substitute away from carbon-intensive products. But I think this is intended, right, by the ETS. This is the standard substitution mechanism. And that's why EU production declines, right? But under ELBAM, it's going to decline less than without the border adjustment mechanism, right? So here you can actually see that the reduction in EU production, well, that is also EU consumption is going to be reduced by 1.10%. So these are the emissions embodied basically in goods that are both produced and consumed in the EU. They go down both because of a technique effect, right? And because of a scale effect, if you want to use the environmental economics expression. Under LBAM, basically the EU production sourced by the EU is going to go down a little bit less, and this is going to reduce emissions a little bit less. There's still a technique effect, but less of the reduction in production.
But if I look at those numbers, it's almost the same as in NOBAM.
In NOBAM, it's 1 point. Yeah, the problem of NOBAM is really that you have the green bar, which is import-related leakage, right? So that we can eliminate with LBAM. But the even larger portion is export-related leakage, which is actually larger than import-related leakage, which we can eliminate with LBAM X, right? So actually this foreign import competition is less important for the EU, as we find, as the replacement of EU exports by third country exports. So this was, I think, your first question. There was another one.
Whether LBAM would affect countries differently.
Yeah.
Countries.
No, I mean, it is exactly designed to, at least LBAM X, right? Keeps everybody in the rest of the world at the status quo ante. So basically, LBAM only on imports still makes some countries worse off because of the EU exports that are replaced by third country exports. That's different basically across countries, how EU exports are replaced by third country exports, right? If you also put export subsidies, then the rest of the world is held constant at the status quo ante, right? So it's neither made better off nor worse off, country by country. And that's why the rest of the world should be indifferent to EU carbon pricing designed in this way.
And this is due to the parameter in your production function?
This is because we hold constant changes in EU imports and changes in EU exports in all sectors, basically. So the export subsidies and the import tariffs are designed to offset any effect of EU carbon price changes on EU imports and exports.
The energy intensity of foreign production is the same throughout.
So this is basically only economic costs, right? So if the rest of the world is held indifferent in terms of economic cost, the rest of the world is actually made better off if you factor in the fact that the world emissions are reduced, right? So under LBAM X, the rest of the world is strictly better off because the economic costs are zero and the environmental benefits to the rest of the world are positive. This is not the case with the other mechanisms because the problem is that countries put very different values on this social cost of carbon, right? Some countries don't seem to care much because otherwise they would have domestic carbon pricing. Can this mechanism of LBAM be manipulated? I would say no, because it's the EU regulator who would design it with objective data, right? So there would be a proposed mechanisms how to estimate the demand and supply elasticities. And given those and the domestic absorption shares, pre-price increase of the ETS, that's sufficient basically to compute these tariffs. So I think this is much harder to manipulate than other mechanisms which require information from the foreign producers on carbon intensities. Energy intensity is actually not computed. It's actually physical energy intensity because we compute this from German microdata where we actually have the physical energy intensity of production.
So you used to estimate this parameter based on German technology?
alpha and beta based on German technology. So there is one assumption, namely that the production function worldwide are basically the same as in Germany. That's maybe a harsh assumption to make. You could use other EU countries as well. We had access to the German data. I'm not saying that we are doing the best job you can potentially do, but this was, I'm sure the EU Commission could do it better than we can do it with all the data they have. How to compute counterfactuals, the tariff adjustment that we would need. Well, so the LBAM formula links basically the tariff adjustment to any change in the ETS price, right? So whenever the ETS price changes, the tariff that we would apply would also change. It is similar to the current CEPR proposal that when the ETS price goes up, you would also need to increase basically the LBAM tariff, yeah? Because the LBAM tariff is also directly linked basically to the energy price PZ I had change. How could we deal with agriculture? True, so agriculture has a very different production function. So you, I think, could apply the same idea to agriculture, but you would need to estimate a different production function for agriculture that has process-related emissions that are related to fertilizers, and I don't know what, right? I'm not a specialist, but I think the idea would work for other goods as well.
Thank you for the answers. And I return to the audience. Are there any comments, questions? No, I see no hand raised. Then, Mr. Fadinger, thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation. You also covered the smallest sector in the economy with a very big share of emissions. Thank you for that, because this was my personal interest in inviting you. And if there are no other comments or questions, thank you very much. And I'm hoping that your efforts with your colleagues are inspiring not only me, but also many other people.
Thank you very much for the invitation.